Recording now. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the first Hate Crime Research Group webinar for this academic year. I am very excited and it's a huge honor to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Martin Glynn, visiting professor in Creative Pedagogy at Birmingham City University, who will cover the topic Black Men, Invisibility and Crime towards a critical race theory of desistance. The presentation is being recorded. So if you have any questions, thoughts, reflections, you can share these at the end. We will not be recording the Q&A aspect of the presentation. So the presentation will last about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will have maybe 10-15 minutes for questions, thoughts, reflections. And the presentation will also be shared via the BSc Hate Crime Network YouTube channel. I know you're all looking forward to hearing more from Martin, so I will now hand over to Martin for the presentation. Over to you, Martin.
All right, thank you. Anyway, greetings, people. I want to get my slides through quick and then get into a discussion, and as you'll see why. So I'm just going to move on. I want to thank everybody for kind of turning up. I'm putting that slide up there because for those of you who want to know what a 45-year career looks like, that's what it looks like. I'm going to start from the bottom up. I'm a children's author, crime fiction writer, screenwriter, dramatist, data storyteller. I lecture in Black Studies, Sociology, Criminology, Creative Pedagogy. I'm a criminologist. I'm the head of research in a centre that I set up, and I'm now a visiting professor. The reason it's important because for 45 years, I've sustained my engagement with the issue of race and specifically Black men. I always get asked, why isn't that included women? Because at the time when I started, Black feminism was very clear. We will do our own investigation. And so I stepped to one side and let people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins do that. Because I believe in being ideologically clear that I'm not there to tread on other people's toes. What I'm there to do is to say, that's what it takes to get to where I'm at. The visiting professorship is unpaid, but what it's done, it's finally allowed me now to look at what we do in what I call creative justice, which will become clear later on. I also want to emphasize to everybody that I'm interested now in connecting with people outside of BCU because I want to help the next generation move on. So this is not just a one-off, we'll never speak again. I did a Winston Churchill Fellowship back in 2010, where I spent time on the streets with the Crips and the Bloods. And the reason I put this up there is because I'm internationally known for my work. And one of the key things in my visiting professorship, I've now got responsibility for South America, North America, the Caribbean, and Africa. So I've now got a global remit based on the work that I've done before. So again, one of the things I would advise all of you is to make sure that you build an international profile and move it away from just being locally known. You have to be national and international to begin to have those big conversations. This picture was taken in East Baltimore. 4 men came up to me when I was out there. East Baltimore is very violent, yet these guys are part of a private school. They're aspirational. They want to be senators, governors. They want to be the president of the United States. What's the relevance? When I was growing up, I had white researchers tell me around the correlation to do with violence and race. And that's one of the reasons that Black people are in the position they are. Well, this private school was set up by an undertaker. It wasn't a university. It wasn't social services. It wasn't the school system. It was people who buried so many people. There's a 5-year waiting list for this school. What it kind of demonstrated, it challenged the kind of concentric circles model that you can't succeed in the inner city. This was in Baltimore. And the reason I'm saying that is because we always focus on the deficit model around race, not actually what emerges from it as a consequence. And what these guys are is an example of post-traumatic growth syndrome, where they're growing through the trauma. I'll put these up. I'm not a lover of statistics, but as of June the 30th, roughly under 84,000 prisoners. You notice the population of female offenders is low. If we had statistics of female victims, it'd be a hell of a lot higher. The foreign national population, 10,000. But when you start to look at it, black men, 12%, black young people, 32%, black women, 8.9%. If you put that as a demographic into the prison population as a whole, you'll see, considering that black people represent probably 3 or 4% of the population, there's a disproportionate representation within prisons as a whole. And that goes for victims of crime. And I put that there because I did a session yesterday at the Violence Reduction Partnership in Birmingham. And what you realize is the VRPs, the police and crime commissioners, are struggling to engage with the enormity of the problem, so it never gets looked at or addressed, which means that it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. You've got young black people in the community right now who almost are leaving school and almost accepting casually, like they do in the States, well, when I leave school, I'm probably going to end up going to jail anyway, so I might as well behave a certain way. So those are that's the statistics. But I want to just read this out. This is a fact. The history, preoccupation, and structural role of the criminal justice system for adults and juveniles have ensured the political, social, and economic subordination of these nations' minorities. If I do it on a global level, the Maori community, Australian Aborigines, the Inuits, when I look at the global position, non-white people are the most over-incarcerated group in the world. In the world. So therefore, it's no longer good enough to talk about black people in Britain. It's a global phenomenon. And I don't disconnect what I do from the global work of indigenous scholars, global South scholars. I'm part of an international narrative. And this was written about in 1995. I wrote about it, but I found when I started to pursue this work, I got a hell of a lot of flack because I started to criticize criminology and those criminologists who would not look at race and wanted to tell me it was purely about class. So, and I said, when you say working class black people, we're looking at class differential. We're not looking at the issue of black, which is race. So that's just that there for that. Well, this is what I want to start with. In 1601, Elizabeth I wrote a letter that's saying that black people needed to be taken out of the UK completely in 1601, Elizabeth I. So she wanted to do a form of ethnic cleansing. She wanted to drive every black person. The interesting thing for me, which historians have got wrong, because if Elizabeth I felt there was too many black people in the country, how did she gather the evidence to support her desire to kick people out? Which would suggest that in the Elizabethan period, there was a lot of black people here. Yet, historically, spices were brought to this country, cloth, gold, diamonds. So therefore, there's a bit of an anomaly historically that on one level, she wanted to get non-white people out, but this country from the reign of Elizabeth I relied heavily on the resources from those places which the Queen first, Elizabeth I, was trying to get rid of people out there. Point being is, for those of you, whether you're a feminist researcher, whether you are a queer researcher, environmental researcher, you have to locate the context of your work historically. Because if you're postmodern, you're going to be thinking everything started with Donald Trump or Keir Starmer. That's not the case. And in this case, 1601. And I can go back before that. Another thing I wanted to point out, slavery colonization increased the criminalization of Black people. Indigenous scholars understand Maoris, Native Americans, Aboriginals in Australia. They understand the role of history in subjugating them, which led to how criminal behavior from those communities were formulated. Therefore, you cannot look at race without looking at slavery and colonization. You can't. But most people do, because they want to say it's because we're poor, because we're this, because we're that. Slavery was not started by Black people, nor was colonization. It was not started by oppressed people. Therefore, there's a question historically. It's funny when people talk about slavery as a kind of moral outrage, and it was, but it was an act that was illegal. Slavery was illegal. Colonization was the illegal occupation of foreign lands. But nobody frames slavery and colonization, I hear, as a criminal offense. So the criminalization of Black people was central to those things. That now makes what we call Western Europe. Yet we have the third world who, as a consequence of that system, completely still struggle and are economically dependent around the world. And that's a fact that people don't want to deal with. Right-wing populism, as we're now seeing. We're seeing this around the world. We're seeing it on the streets of the UK. We are seeing it all over. And what's ironic, right-wing populism, very few people want to say it's about nationalism, racialized rhetoric. If you're Black, trust me, you don't sit there and think this is right-wing populism, but it is, because it shows you how politics of race has now got, it's called right-wing populism. But in the Second World War, Hitler and the Jewish community, Mussolini, this is nothing new, but it's a modern phenomenon now because of the way it's been practiced and playing out. So once again, I don't understand how we can continue to not acknowledge the racialized rhetoric within the press causing moral panic. I don't understand it. So that's another phenomenon that again is prevalent. The prominence of race in criminal justice has grown to historical legacies of racial control. So you only got to look at the prison industrial complex, slavery, colonialism, institutional and structural racism, which is still prevalent to this day, disproportionate policing. It's a global phenomenon, and media and political narratives. So again, anybody that thinks that it's not prominent, it is. That's the fact. And then we get to the 70s, the Reagan-Thatcher era, the war on drugs. We know that if we look at the history of crack, targeted Black communities. Criminalization over treatment. When you look at the American prison population, over 2 million, still has the death penalty. When you look at the demographics of the criminal justice system in the US, it's huge. But race is a central feature, and policing practices. If you go back in the last, from the shooting of Trayvon Martin, just as a benchmark, if you go back to segregation in America, if you then go back to the American Civil War, I can take you back and back and back and see policing practices. So the context in what I'm talking about, it's intensifying, it's growing. It's not a myth. It's not science fiction. I wrote my book back in 2013, and I wanted to explore the racialization and process of desistance. Because over my years, people ask me, why do Black men get involved in crime? So I decided I want to look at what makes them stop. I was the first person in the world to attempt to do this.
Okay.
And it was really problematic. It was difficult. It was painful to do this research. I went to America. I worked in Baltimore. I went to therapeutic communities like Grendon in the UK. And I wanted to center the voices and lived experience of Black, British, and African American men. And the only frame of reference I could do to do that was critical race theory, because I wanted to do a counter narrative, and it was not. So I didn't want to be making the claims. I wanted the men to speak. And I remember when I was asked to feed my research that I did in Grendon to the Home Office, I refused to do it, and I let the men do it on my behalf. So the distortion in America and here about critical race theory, I had to put up with that. I remember arguing that if it was critical feminist research, nobody would have done the same thing. But critical race, because of the way it's been distorted and exploited, but I managed to get it done. And that formed the backbone of my work in 2013. I then, when George Floyd died, I started to reread Black literature, especially crime fiction. I then went to the history of the Black arts movements. I then started looking at Black music. And I realized that Black artists are much better at critiquing and expressing the understanding of race and crime than social scientists. And I wrote a book on it, because what I wanted to argue, that the community I come from gets its messages not from politicians, not from academics, not from fake news, not from distorted narratives. They get it from Black artists. And so I wrote that book. Again, it went around the world. And it said there, a new criminological imagination, because what I wanted to begin to look at is what role does art play in the way that it shapes the understanding of criminal justice narratives, because the word narrative is a literary term. It's not a criminological term. Therefore, it's fitting to look at the narrative of the artist in the way that they talk about crime and specifically race. So I wrote that. And then I discovered a court case done in 1848 called the Black Rage Defense, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I managed to get hold of 40,000 pages of historical transcripts in the UK that located the Black presence in crime and punishment from 1750 to 1900. And I purposely did it with that period because I didn't want a period when we start to get photography, and I didn't want to do that. I wanted to go to excavate the hidden narrative, and that's what I did. And I had 40,000 pages, and this book emerged, which is about reimagining British criminological history. I didn't say Black history, criminological history, by uncovering the hidden Black presence. And that's what I did. And that's when I realized that one of the most potent pieces of work I've ever done is around the deceit, the lies that have been perpetuated around criminological history and the presence of Black people in it. And I'm not just talking about as victims. From the Chartist movement of William Cuffey to the Cato Street conspiracy to the work of Robert Wedderburn. So I came up with a very different perspective. So those are the three books that in this particular context. And so as a Desistance person, when I started the journey on Desistance, it was mainly people like Fergus McNeill, Stephen Farrell, Shad Maruna, the heavyweights. And I came along and they embraced me. And I decided I'm going to put not just race, but I'm going to demonstrate that if you're not talking about diversity in your understanding of Desistance, then your work's incomplete. Now, rather than me point fingers at them for what because they did incredible stuff that laid the foundation for me, what I decided to do is to demonstrate the issue of race in the context of Desistance. And that's what I ended up doing. And in doing that, I changed the way people look at desistance. Whether it's narrative criminology, it makes no difference. What I managed to do is to put an argument forward that if you're not looking at race, don't stand up and start talking about desistance if you're not including a variable that you've dropped out. Now we have intersectionality in desistance, which is more inclusive. We have other forms of desistance ideas, but I was the first person that come along and dared to say, you've got it wrong, and here's the reason why. And that's what that was about. And Ferguson 2013 recognized that there were 4 pathways to rehabilitation: judicial, social, personal, moral. Because he said that if you cannot navigate the judicial system, if you can't navigate the social structure, your personal rehabilitation won't happen, nor would your moral. So it's pointless saying, we've got to change these people. What he said as a probation expert, that what I did is take this framework, and you will see in front of you, from a rehabilitative point of view, criminal justice systems and racialization, which means if you're disproportionately and aggregated because of race, you can't navigate that. The social structure and racial inequality. So if you can't navigate those 2 things, how are you supposed to develop a pro-social identity and stay crime free? How? And then when it comes to morals, if you as a non-white person, through racialization of the judicial system and social structure, how are you supposed to see white people or living in a society where you're in a minority to be compliant? Because you're being punished because of your difference, not just because of your offending. It's a double bind. You're punished for your offending, but you're also punished alongside the racialization of that reality too. So I reframed the rehabilitative thing that Fergus did and located it within the context of race. Now you can do the same thing with gender, queer theory, environmental crime, but it's about having a grown-up conversation about how this plays out according to the differences we have. So I was fortunate enough to be in Baltimore. I spent time at Johns Hopkins University, and I came across this book, Trauma and Violence in the Lives of Young Black Men. And one statement stuck out: without accessing the voices of young Black people involved in violence, we could easily formulate strategies that are out of sync with their lives. So how are we making claims about violence if you're not up close and personal? How? I don't get it. What, from statistics? No. I've spent 45 years up close and personal with everybody from the Crips and the Bloods and prisons and streets, so I can speak with some kind of authority that what John Rich said is true. But every one of us on this call, anybody that's listening, if you're going to go into this type of work, no matter what you're doing, do not start making claims unless the voices of the people that you're working with are represented. And they're represented with passion and energy, robust work. In my work, these are the key things that I found out. And if I go back to slavery and colonialism and the history of subjugation of Black people historically from Elizabeth I, guess what we've got? Nihilism, where people think, I don't care. So what we got right now, you've got a generation of young Black people that death means nothing to them. Limited social capital. That was the same thing in the reign of Elizabeth I to now. Community disconnect. In the Georgian period and the Victorian period, we had what's called the Black London Poor. Community disconnect. Father absence. Well, when you look at the conditions of slavery, colonialism, no wonder we have father deficit, because history killed off a lot of our men, took them away. Some people are unable to desist. Why? Because of what Fergus McNeill said, that if you can't navigate the criminal justice system and the social structure, How are you supposed to desist? Poor self-concept. The concept of self has been shaped by a society that's eroded a sense of self for many different people, but for black people in particular, it's even worse. When I interviewed a lot of white people about what's your perception of black people. They like music, fashion, sport. There was no real mention of scholarship, education. So what you realize is the self-concept of most white people that I interviewed, and it's not scientifically driven, but there was a lot, and you see this play out in the press, is that the concept in schools where there's no representation of diversity in the curriculum, in the social structure. Robert Jenrick turned around and said there's no black people. You know, when he went to Handsworth, he didn't see a white face. I've never been into a privileged middle-class white community and complained that it needs to be integrated because it's more sophisticated, much more sophisticated than that. But that self-concept is shaped by a society and a history that has eroded a sense of who I am, what I am, why I am. Microaggressions. Microaggressions is interesting because we all suffer from microaggressions. If you're a woman, comments from men. If you're a young person, you get microaggressions from adults. But microaggressions seem to be lumped into the issue of race. But if everybody realizes that everybody's difference gets put upon, then we'd actually stop saying microaggressions is just purely targeted at black people. It's not. We all suffer from microaggressions. I get it because I'm a pensioner now. So I'm getting microaggressions, you know. So in a way, but that's what came up. The relentless ridicule and put down and slights of black offenders and historical invisibility that I've talked about. Those are the 8 key things that emerged. And this chart here is just really to say, when I looked at the psychological and emotional impact of all of this history and all of this, these ingredients come up. Masking. We've all done it. How you feeling? I'm okay. Distorted blackness. Stop and search. Constantly being berated. Dealing with the far right. Not being explained what the English flag is or the British flag outside your school. Hypervigilance. Walking into white spaces and how do you behave? How do you talk? How do you act? Status frustration. On one level, you're told, get your head down. But on another level, you're told to be cautious when you get on a bus. You're taught to be law-abiding, but you're also taught to be cautious of the police because they might stop and search you. So you become frustrated with your status. Self-doubt. Shall I go into the house tonight because my parents tell me I've got to be in early? Or do I go out with my brethren on the road? That leads to an internal retreat, which then leads to what we call anger and rage, which leads to a crisis. When I did the research on adverse childhood experience, what I found out is the fact that young people have adverse childhood experiences, young black people between 0 and 15. At the age of 15, it's so strong, and the pathology on it, they start with the imposter syndrome as young as 15, where they never believe they're good enough. And they carry that on right through their life because there's no positive reinforcement post-15. So again, what I've discovered, the psychology of the impact of racialization and criminal justice is now what you see with the music, drill, trap, grime, hip hop. There's not a lot of positive messaging coming from that, but it's an articulation of what people feel about where they're at. And in 2025, we're not in the civil rights era where we had Motown and James Brown and we had the music. It's completely different. In 1843, Daniel McNaughton was the guy on the left. he was upset with politicians and it drove him to distraction, and he went to kill Robert Peel, but he ended up killing his secretary, and he's found declared insane at the time of the offence, and it led to the first case in criminal justice history of the insane defence, whether you're fit to stand trial. In 1846, the same legal defence was tried in America, where a young African American murdered 4 white people and was found not guilty on appeal on the basis of the McNaughton rules, which led to what was called the Black Rage defence. The relevance to now is our young people, when they witness a murder or a shooting or aggressive policing, nobody questions whether they were temporarily insane at the time of the offence. There's a mitigating service in the trial. But we know that as far back as 1843 or 1846, racism and the extremity of it drives people temporarily insane. And there's lots of legal cases in America. And we see over here where when you hear the judge will say the young person showed no remorse, well, it may be that they're mentally ill whilst they're standing in front of the judge as a consequence of the trauma. Nobody really thinks of the psychological impact of repeated stop and search or witnessing pain, what you saw with George Floyd, Tamir Rice. So once again, there is such a term as the Black Rage defense, but it's the McNaughton rules. So once again, for those scholars looking at this, when you're looking at offending patterns, or when you're looking at the impact of the trauma that's inflicted within criminal justice, you have to begin to question. But there's a legal precedent set, which is the McNaughton rules, that define mental health in criminal justice. So, because I want to get into questions in a minute, new vistas. If you're studying race now, you've got to look at social media. You've also got to look at the impact of AI. Technology is going to change forever the way that you look at race, class, gender, faith, all of it. And if you're not factoring that in, then the question is, why not? So those are the new vistas. For those of you that want to build on race, we have now Black criminology. We have Indigenous criminology, Southern criminology, and intersectionality in criminology. So it's no longer a case of taking the criminology that exists and applying it that way to Black people. No. There is a complete revision within criminology now, as you've seen. Black criminology looks at the issue of race and racism. Indigenous is the role of history and colonialism. Southern criminology is how the global North and the global South operates. So that's more about the third world and how it sees itself. And intersectionality for feminists, Black women, and for people like myself, it's a more sophisticated lens to view criminology. We need to have more culturally responsive practices. A lot of researchers get ethical approval without any justification for looking at diversity. Being white and going into a Black community has consequences, the same as me being Black, working with working class young white men has consequences. Culturally responsive practice ethically means you're accountable for your difference in the research domain, in your teaching, and anywhere you are. Creative pedagogy, which is where I'm at right now with my professorship, is an approach to teaching and learning that emphasizes innovation, imagination, and artistic expression in the way that we investigate, the way that we teach, and the way the claims we make, because Indigenous people, Black people, understand their world through creative expression. And therefore, the research that we do should reflect that in the way that we gather data. Black arts therapy. One of the things that I've been very clear about in my work over the years is the way in which how the intersection of art, criminal justice, and creativity affects the psychic functioning of Black people in relationship to their self-concept. And if you're a Muslim, you should be using Islamic frames. If you're a woman, you should be using women's frames. If you are gay, you should be using frame that represents that. The day of the monocultural, heterosexual, white male, that's done. And I'm not being awkward about it because they've massively influenced me. But for the ones who were still alive, they said, Martin, we were of our time. We were part of the Chicago school, but it's moved on. I've moved it on. Your job is to continue to move it on. Took 5 years to get this done, but the latest article that came out in 2024 was towards a critical race criminology. I was so disgusted with criminology as a discipline. I wrote a paper, threw it away, didn't want to do anything with it. My colleague, Associate Professor Damien Breen, took it. 5 years later, he said, we couldn't get it published. And I remember we wanted to put in theoretical criminology, and it was like, no. And then he said, let's put in critical criminology. And anybody that knows about critical criminology is like the hardest journal to get it in. We stuck with it. We got it published. So I laid the foundation for critical race criminology. Why? Not because I can do anything with it. As a foundation for people that want to pick it up and run with it. And I have to say, it took 5 years. Was it worth it? Yes, because we got it in the top journal. And so finally, my new book is on storytelling for crime and justice, so that there's now a book where anybody can pick up, and it's a handbook, a toolkit for you guys. So it's full of practical exercises from the use of photo, voice, podcasting, film, fiction, because I want to give you a toolkit so that you can actually experiment, play around with, have fun with, connect to your own cultural context. And then finally, Spiral Acts is a workbook for creative justice that I created as part of my professorship. And what that's about is about 300 exercises you can put in the classroom to engage students from diverse backgrounds. Why? Because I'm not one of those people that just wants to stand. I don't do conferences. I may do in the future, but I don't do that. What I'm interested in is supplying the troops with tools to go out there and fight, because that's what you're talking about. And I'm representative of somebody that's done 45 years. I am the original child that was raised by the village. And having spent 45 years and come to a point as a professor, I've earned that. I've earned it. But I'm now in legacy territory. So it's not just a case of passing on what I know, but I've got to get it embedded before I go. And then finally, what I did with my work now is to critique why things fail. Fergus McNeill introduced me to what's called the Copernican model. Copernicus allegedly discovered the Earth revolved around the sun. What you see here is the X, which is what we get is pervasive in probation, youth offending, prison, and the police, with the agency is in the center of the universe, the community is excluded, and the person that we want to change is on the outside. What is successful is when the person changing is in the center of the universe, the community is included, and the agencies on the outside. So if you're doing academic research and you take that model where the agency is, you won't be liaising with community. You'll go straight to the person changing who's on the outside of you, because the metrics that you're measured in university, yeah, you might get a good paper out of it, but it won't give the voices and the experience. Whereas the Copernican model in university means that that person has to be centered. So participatory approaches to research, artistic approaches, action research approaches with community support will give you a better outcome. So in a way, it sounds like it's gone through it quick. We've got 20 minutes to have some conversation, but I kind of just really wanted to show you that The professorship will take me around the world, finally. It's given me a voice. One of the benefits of being a visiting professor, it's unpaid, which means nobody can point the finger at me and say, you're doing this for the money. No. Now, with that label being bestowed upon me, I can take all that I've learned. And so a professor of creative pedagogy is committed to exactly that. So I've managed to transcend race and become where I'm recognized now as somebody that can bring creative and culturally responsive processes to research, teaching, and whatever I choose to do. But to conclude, unless this is part of a concerted approach, a collaborative partnership, then it won't work. So now, I don't want to convince people that I'm worth working with. What I'm saying, if you're a feminist researcher or you're struggling or you're at a crossroads, I've been there. I took 45 years, and a friend of mine, still a dear colleague, Mohammed Rahman, told me straight. When I was walking, I wanted to walk away from all of this. And he said, Uncle, he said, I'm Muslim. He says, maybe one thing to learn, it takes over 40 years to do one thing well. And he was right. I never sought validation. I never went to people to ask for anything. I never got funded for my research. I did it. But I always remember what Mo told me. And when he did that, I had one book. Now I've got 6, which means I've actualized it in the way that Howard Becker did, Irving Goffman, and all the people that went before me. So I'm part of a continuum. And I've learned that finally. So I'm available, ready, willing to support wherever I can unapologetically, because now I've got 40 book chapters and articles, 6 books, 45-year history. I did it authentically. I never pandered to agendas. I never went to the conferences. I never promoted myself. And so when I got the reward, I still said it, unless it's a shared space and platform, then I'm not interested. And so finally, the acceptance of third space education, where learning can take place in non-traditional spaces, I finally arrived. And I'm not bitter, because I've arrived. So, as I said, 15 minutes, and please fling questions out. So I want to thank you, but that's a very quick snapshot of where it's at. So let me just open it up to the floor. I was going to say the floor, the screen. Yeah. No,
Thank you so much, Martin. Thank you. And thank you is not enough for your influential and, really, really informative and inspiring talk, but all the work you've been doing. And we have been following you, as students and, academics. So a massive thank you. And also for your time today. I will stop the recording now, because, as I said, some people might feel reluctant to ask questions if they are being recorded. So I will
that's
stop the
fine.
recording.
And just